Okay. I should have started this stream a while ago. Well, I did start this stream a while ago, but I didn't like the first one, so I unlisted it a while ago. But okay, this stream microphone is working. Let's open up Krita then. Okay. So, as the title says, I'm going to be talking about money, currency, capital, trade, crypto, kind of, but basically the lifeblood of what we call trade or modern day trade. All right. So, money. I don't. This is not going to be a financial stream. First and foremost, it's going to be a stream where I talk about the uses of money, right? So, one of my favorite uses of money is bribes, right? We all know that. Um, Purchase power, purchase goods, manufacturing, 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 or whatever. What else? Quite a lot of uses for money. Now I'm going to talk about some of the qualities, which one of them is that it's printable, right? It's manageable. It's also used for the underground. And by underground, I'm talking about, illegal services. That goes. Ugh. Where is my mind right now? Alright, whatever. I'm just gonna put illegal trade. I don't know why I can't spell right now. Besides that, we also have a variety of other things that money has, in the sense that there are financial firms. Right? I'm essentially describing the fact that money has a variety of usages. This is something that I didn't get into the last time I did this, because I got caught up in trying to explain the whole and not necessarily describing the aspect of what money is used for. Um, Either way, we also have budgets. Now, where am I gonna go with this? Right? I think when I did the education stream, I talked about the budgets. I talked about how there's the allocation period. Oh yeah, I should also mention what do they call them? Fiscal years. Fiscal years, right? How the year is separated into four different quarters. Da 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 da. So money has this form of what I would call ecology. Ugh. Ecology. It has its own ecosystem. It has its own half life, right? And the reason why I'm bringing up the term half life is because think of that as a life period where, because this would go into printable. Because it's printable, there is a form of circulation. Now, in its circulation, when money is printed, it somehow has to make its way into the circulation. It has to be inserted into the economy through one way or another. So we have to think of this as pools or accounts. Ugh. I'm trying a new sensitivity. It's not working very well the way I thought I anticipated. Um, hmm. This has to go into currencies. So pools, accounts. So kind of one of the stories that I like to tell is I was in a film class, And my film professor was very, when I say woke, I don't mean the way that it's defined today. Back in those days, it was woke in the sense that he viewed it for what it was. He was awake to how money was circulating. And the reason why I bring up pools and accounts is because he would always describe the fact that anytime money was allocated for a budget or for foreign aid or anything like that, he would talk about how the Senate would pass a bill for 1 point, let's just say 2 billion to round it off. But by the time that it would get to wherever it was going, Africa, Israel, Europe, in this case it would be Ukraine, the money had to make hops. The money had to go from one location to another location to another location. And that's why I bring up accounts. Because the way the banking system works is there has to be a form of transfer of from accounts we could go into what I would call transfers. And in this transfer, a bank account, or banks in general, have a fee associated with that. And the way that this fee comes about is, that's where a portion of the money would disappear or it would get cut, because the fee is associated with what we call the SWIFT system. Now, the SWIFT system is just this kind of like this bilateral agreement where all of the banks have a sort of an agreement with one another where they would use this transfer protocol where, I guess I could describe how SWIFT works. SWIFT has to work real time. So if the money is going to Africa, that means that the bank that's being communicated to in Africa needs a corresponding bank in America to accept that agreement of transfer. And that has to happen real time. So both people have to be awake at the same time. And that's kind of where this fee is incurred. But the way that our professor described it back in high school, so this was already over 15 years ago, he would always talk about how the accounts that the money was being transferred into, a portion of that money was being sliced out, and then the fee would incur. Because sometimes these fees wouldn't reach astronomical numbers. Sometimes they would reach 4 digits, 5 digits. In most cases, they were up to 6 digits. So he would talk about it, that it was a soft form of money laundering. Now, either way. So money has this aspect that it's printable. And with this printable principle, we would have to then go into currency. But I don't want to go there yet. So, now with it being manageable, you have these institutions. I guess a great one would be the FDIC. I think this is an insurance type of firm. But there are a variety of different firms that kind of manage the circulation of money. And another one that most people don't like is the IRS. Now, the Internal Revenue Stream, that's a different form of management, because that goes into taxes and that goes into a whole other ecosystem, a whole another ecological circulation system. Now, before we go into currency, what else do I want to talk about? Right, another form of manageable would be financial firms, because there are a variety of different financial firms. Some of the most popular ones that have come into the sphere of the thought realm is BlackRock. Now, people talk about BlackRock, but nobody ever talks about Vanguard. And Vanguard is a very interesting institution, because they themselves not only manage money, but they are a trust. And that goes into a whole other realm of thought. But Vanguard has trust. They themselves have bonds. They also themselves have stocks. But not stocks in the sense of you can buy stocks. It's a private firm. So most of their stock sales are through private ventures. So when I say stocks, I'm talking about What are those stocks called? It's on the tip of my tongue here. It's the sort of stocks that get bundled up together. So like if you just want to invest in technology as a whole, there are these groupings where they'll group together companies like Microsoft, Apple. They'll group them together, put them in one big stock. So if any of the stocks within that group of stocks does well, the overall package of stocks goes up as well. So Vanguard is a very interesting institute because nobody really talks about the sort of power that they wield in, and that goes into like financial firms. Also goes into committee boards. Should make that line longer. You're right. I don't even know how to spell committee. Oh my god, I'm a bit stupid. So either way, committees. And then we also have, with committees, we have a board of directors. Not just board of directors, but essentially what we would call major stockholders. Now, we've all heard through movies, through television, through some form of entertainment that sometimes companies make decisions not based on the general public opinion, but what the stockholders want overall. And, you know, being a major stockholder is sometimes owning anywhere, ugh, I should write better numbers, like 5%, 10%, right? Holding anywhere above 5% or 10% of a stock makes you a major stockholder. So your opinion would hold some value when it comes down to the board of directors. And remember, the board of directors, you can think of them as managers, right? Because their say so kind of dictates and guides what essentially happens with the company, the corporation, etc., etc. Either way. And essentially, budgets and committees are tied to one another because at the end of the day, the budget is decided on by an accountant, and the accountant always has to write up a report, and that report is always given to the board of directors or major stockholders, or the report goes to some form of analyst, and the analyst would make decisions that would accordingly correspond with whatever they would want the budget to be. So, and this is where you would get into fiscal years and quarterly reports and all sorts of other things. Now, manageable, printable. All right, and I'm just going into the manageable aspect of things, and that's right. So, I always view these things as petri dishes. They have their own form of ecology. The way that they interact with the greater whole is very different from what people's expectations are. And and the reason for that is because people view it as this integrated system, but it's not very integrated. A lot of the times it's very segregated in the sense that they only care for their own interest at heart, and they'll never really care for the interest of the greater whole, which comes down to the community, consumers, etc., etc. And I guess this is where we could get into bribes. Now, bribes are very important in our reality. People like to think that there are no form of bribes. People like to think. Now, when I say these things, I really do mean it. I really mean that people don't expect there to be any form of bribery that corresponds with companies, corporations, and their corresponding counterparts, or at least the people receiving them. People off rip. I'm not talking about the people watching this. I'm talking about society as a whole. People do not want to believe that, like, committees who decide our overall health, what would that be called? Not the CDC, the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, right? So people like to assume that bribes do not occur on the level of the FDA, or at least and our overall food, well-being, farms, so forth and so forth, right? Because you can aim this at any sector of consumerisms. There is always a form of bribery that occurs, always, and it's very deeply rooted in the fact that, let's say we had a river, right? This river has a flow, a stream, whatever. At the top of it is Wall Street. Because at the end of the day, these are the people that get to dictate the flow of money, the flow of currency. Downstream, you get politicians. Now, there's a reason for this. Is because a lot of the times when Wall Street wants to do something, they have a genius plan on doing something, there's usually these pesky laws that get in their way. It's either laws or, what's another word that I'm looking for? Regulations, public opinion. There are these things that kind of hinder their way, right? So let's say that, like, there's this log blocking the flow of money. Well, the way that Wall Street kind of solves their problem is, hey, politicians, we'll just give you a bunch of money. Help us out with this bill or this policy. And the politicians are like, well, I have to consider my voting base. That's just lip service. Or that's just what's right. And that lip service is only for the media coverage or, hit pieces. That comes in the form of right, left, any social, political paradigm that people kind of assume. And they forget that at the end of the day, politicians have to adhere to one thing. That's where this comes in, budgets. Because politicians at the end of the day are tied down by their 2 years of service or their 4 years of service. So Wall Street knows this. They know that the limitations that these politicians have is anywhere from 2 years to 4 years. So they know for a fact all they have to do is play the waiting game. If politicians or public opinion isn't in their favor, they'll just wait. And if they have any sort of problem, the bill or the policy that they're trying to pass to make sure that this river flows the way that they want it to, they'll just kind of name the bill or the policy, they'll name it something nice. They'll name it the Green Initiative. They'll name it Stop Eating Meat. They'll name it Stop Cow Farts, right? They'll name it something to kind of sway public opinion. And public opinion now is manipulated through schools, through protest, through I want to say shiny names, but what would be a good word? Glamour. We'll call it glamour. Either way, glamours. But right, they kind of spit on it, rub it on, looks all nice and shiny and pretty. It'll pass through, right? Because at the end of the day, the people who are protesters or the people who are protesting don't realize that they think. A lot of this comes down to what people think. And what people think usually comes down from a deeply rooted place where they don't realize that their emotions are just being played with. And this is what I call the hallmark effect. Now, hallmark means something entirely different. But the hallmark effect essentially would come down to, when they sell those cards, or at least anytime you ever saw a Hallmark commercial, it would be something that had the imagery or the commercial itself was kind of told in such a pace where it grabs you from the heartstrings. It kind of pulls you from your emotions to kind of primer you or to prime you from a position of my feels. This is what I feel. And when it pulls you from that direction, it's kind of easy to get protesters to kind of do whatever you want. Now, so bribes are very, very, very deeply rooted in American history. And I wouldn't say that the bribe game kind of changed. Bribing people from the 1800s, or at least the late 1800s of American history, is very different from the bribing that occurred from, I want to say, 1910 and so forth and so forth. Because the name of the game changed. And kind of where all of this came from evolved with it, because the people at Wall Street were also funding scientists. And they always had this deeply rooted understanding of how to sway public opinion, because at the end of the day, when you have somebody who wants to make as much money as possible, they're going to look at, or at least fund people, scientists or analysts, to kind of understand where the problem is coming from. And they'll pay these firms exorbitant amount of money just to kind of figure out how to hack into minds, hack into emotions, and sway public opinion. So bribe and money, very deeply related, very deeply closely integrated, and it has been this way for as long as possible. And the whole scientist analyst thing, that's where I always point to cybernetics. Because cybernetics was essentially an early science, 1940s. So when I say cybernetics, don't think computers, don't think AI. That wasn't in the realm of thought yet, at least during this time period. That came later, but cybernetics was just a way for it was the bridge between understanding the human organism and how to input data into our, like, how do I say this? It's kind of like a Hallmark effect, right? They understood what sort of imagery needs to be put on the television, what sort of music needs to be played to kind of activate certain neurons, or at least to have a certain chemical reaction within the brain in order to push the right buttons to communicate to the right emotions to then sway public opinion. And this is where science and analysts kind of come in. But remember, all of this comes from Wall Street. And not just Wall Street, because, we say Wall Street and we think companies, corporations, the people who kind of rent the floors on that street. But in reality, it's a much more deeply rooted problem, because it isn't Wall Street at the end of the day. Because Wall Street are just the front-facing corporations, companies, LLCs. That's just the front face of it. When you get even deeper into this Rubik's Cube, we'll call it that, Wall Street is composed of firms. And this comes in the many faces of lawyers, conglomeracies. I'm a bit dumb, so I don't know how to spell that word. Trust. And with trust, right, I'm talking about like board of directors that, right, remember, board of directors are just managers. They just manage the funds they manage the assets, or at least they manage the revenue that these certain trusts kind of generate, and they manage the money accordingly. Because at the end of the day, the trust, or at least the UBO, the ultimate beneficiary owner, UBO, ultimate beneficiary owner, that's the final say-so of the person who owns the trust. At the end of the day, the owner has no real say in how the trust is managed. In reality, the people who really have a say, or at least most form of power over the trust, are the board of directors. And that's where, kind of hire the best accountants, you kind of hire the best CEOs, the best managers, the best district managers, right? The people who do the actual legwork. The ultimate beneficiary owner just kind of reaps the benefits of revenue. So, either way. And that's just in bribes, right? That's just me describing the Wall Street element of things. Because remember, at the end of the day, CEOs are just managers. The board of directors are just managers. These people just do the legwork. In reality, they don't really own anything. At the end of the day, over the heads of people of Wall Street are their salaries. No, salaries and contracts, right? Whatever they kind of sign on to. We'll get more into that later. Right? That's just the bribe aspect of money. Now, when we get into purchase, goods, and manufacturing, all three of these things, purchase power, I think is what I should call this, have one thing in common. And that's the common folk. The common folk, right? The people who, right, we think CEOs and managers and accountants and all these fancy little titles that they get at the front of their desk, right? All of that. That's a whole other ecosystem, right? That's an ecosystem of the aristocrats. You can call them that. But below them, you get the common folk. And the common folk have one thing in common. They're there for purchasing power. They're there to purchase these goods. And they're also there for the manufacturing element of things. Because at the end of the day, common folk are the biggest source of revenue. And the revenue is all reaped to this. Politicians, because common folk have to have voting power. Right? So their voting power gets to dictate where politicians come from. But the revenue will ultimately go to Wall Street. Not just Wall Street, but goes into companies. Go right there. It's just a form of revenue, is all I'm saying, right? It's just another stream that is created. We say stream, but we could also call it, because there is a form of psyche power. And when I say psyche power, I'm talking about what is in the minds of people and where their energy is kind of pointed to. And that's kind of where you get a lot of the glorification of like brands, trends, all this other stuff. So we could just put that here. Brands, trends. We could also put social media because that's a big thing now, but whatever. Either way. So the common folk kind of dictate these three principles: the purchasing power, goods, and manufacturing. But these three things are governed by money. And money, at the end of the day, remember, is printable. So the common folk need a physical form. A physical form of transactions. Right? I don't have any actual physical money on me right here. But, you know, bills, $1, $2, whatever the fuck. In our case, in the United States, it's the United States dollar. In Mexico, it's the peso. In the Philippines, it's also the peso. England, the pound. The euro in Europe, or the European Union, etc., so forth and so forth. Still not going to get into currency just yet, right? Now, with this revenue, we get the IRS, or at least what we call taxes. And taxes are given up to government. I'm just going to put government because it's different around the world. And that's just a portion of it. Because revenue also goes into your livelihood. Your livelihood. You know, which comes in the form of rent, food, shelter. What do I want to call that? Satiation. Because your livelihood also is encompassed in the sense that your form of entertainment is what I want to call it. But entertainment, right? Because you have to entertain yourself. Well, like, right, you can't just make money and not entertain yourself, or at least I say entertainment, but in reality, I'm just talking about what is the thing that distracts you? What is the thing that distracts the common folk? And that's where you kind of get the saying of give them circus bread and whatever. It's kind of like that old Roman saying. But right, this is where the physical form of things has to come into play, because revenue creates its own other form of ecology, which is the trade aspect of things. That's kind of damn, now I really can't remember that saying, but it's that that whole thing of shiny new toys. What is that shiny new thing that you're working towards, etc., etc. But whatever. Now, where else could I go from this? Guess we can go into the underground illegal trade of things, because there are some goods that are illegal. You can't just have them, right? One of the oldest ones was weed or marijuana. Now that's getting legalized. Forms of opium. I kind of want to say adrenochrome, but that's a bad word. You can't be saying that now, right? But there are goods that are illegal, and that creates this other form of purchasing power. What do you call it? Wants, needs, or desirability factor? No. The word that I'm looking for that I can't pop in my head right now. What do you demand? Oh, that was hard. Right? Things that are deemed illegal have a form of demand, right? Now, I guess an example that I could use is because I'm going to the gym, right? I always hear these conversations in the gym, but right, a form of an illegal demand would be steroids, and how there is this, right? There's this own ecology factor in terms of the fitness world has this desire or demand for this product. And I've heard stories that some people will buy it from India, some people will buy it from Germany. And the reason they'll go that route is because, right, creating a demand, because the product, where's my cursor? The product itself has this uniqueness factor to the product, right, versus the US product, right? It all comes down to this or that. There's always this nature of duality in a demand, because just as much as you can get one thing, there is this other thing, right? It always comes down to this other thing, either or. But right, there is this whole underground trade, this illegal goods trade. Some people say that there is no slave market, but I would beg to differ. So forth and so forth, right? Now, that's just the uses of money. Now, where I do want to go into this from money, I kind of want to go into currency now. Slide. Call it currency. Now, let's see. Get into the middle of this page. Straighten it out. Let's talk about currency, right? Currency is far different from money, because as currency is a form of money, there's a big difference. Currency describes money from different sectors. Just like how I said that the US has the dollar, Mexico has the peso, Korea has the won, Japan has the yen. I know that there would be some Koreans and some Japanese that would get pissed at the fact that I put these two together, because they have a tumultuous history. The Euro Union has the euro. The Brits have the pound. The denarii. Where's the denarii from? Can't remember. I'm just gonna put denarii. Denarii. All right. All I'm saying is that there are these different forms of paper bills. Right, and these paper bills have their own form of ecology. Right, they have their own petri dish, their own different sector of the world that they govern, and their own little different sector of river, trade, goods, bribery, etc., etc. But it all kind of expands the same way, right? Because they'll all have a financial sector. That financial sector would have very close ties with law firms, politicians, campaigns, etc., etc. Right? There are similarities. There are just minute differences in the way that they handle their policy, the way that they handle their movement of trade, or at least the movement of their money, so on and so on. Oh, fuck. I forgot. I still need to drink my protein shake. Okay. Where else can I go from this? Now, all of these currencies have one thing in common. And that's where it comes down to... it's too big. I don't know. What is it? This one? Okay. Still getting used to the sensitivity in this. And that is, they're all printable. Right? And the printable factor is different when you're talking about currency. Because at the end of the day, what backs these currencies is their own ecosystem. Right? Because all of these bills, right, all of these paper bills can only be used within their ecosystems. They cannot be used internationally. Right? That's where you have to go to, what do you call those places? Like a currency exchange? We'll just call it that, a currency exchange shop. Currency exchange shop, right? And each exchange rate is different. Now, what decides that? I'm pretty sure there's this international body. I think it's called the IMF. I'm not entirely too sure. I'm just going to write that down here. For those who don't know, the IMF is the International Monetary Fund? Firm? Either way, Christine Lagarde, I think, is the current head of that organization. Punto aparte, which means period, separated. That's something that, so when I went to school in Mexico, when they say punto y aparte, that just means put a period, next sentence. Either way. Oh yeah, they don't write stuff on the board, or at least the school I went to didn't write stuff on the board. The teacher would just kind of speak, and you would just have to hurry and write everything that guy was saying, and then they would expect you, whatever. Currency exchange shops, right? So each currency has its own ecosystem, right? Now, the currency exchange shop is kind of the legal way of doing things, right? Remember that. That's the legal way of doing things. Of course, just like anything else, there are illegal brokers who kind of also do the same thing, but they do it in a way where, I'm not saying that the money itself is illegal, I'm just saying that they operate outside of the books. And when I say books, I'm talking about ledgers. We'll get into that in a little bit, right? So, all of these countries understand that all of their paper currency falls short because of one aspect of itself, and that's the fact that it's printable. So at the end of the day, to a large degree, these countries have no trust for one another. They don't trust in one another because they all know that the bills themselves are susceptible to their own ecosystem. So, at the end of the day, the United States isn't in a position where they want to accept currency from a different country in their currency, because they fall short in the fact that that would force the country itself to use that money within their own ecosystem. Who wants to do that, right? Like, it puts you at a disadvantage, because it puts you at the disadvantage of the exchange shop, or at least the exchange rate. So, now I'll just put it right here. The exchange rate system. Not to say that they can't manipulate the market, because, right, all you would need is a couple $1 billion and some crafty maneuverability through paper firms or paper companies. And either way, gets into speculation, because you can't prove it, because it's never been proven. Either way, because these countries have no trust with one another, that's where back in the day we had the gold standard. Right? The gold standard was essentially countries kind of trade with one another in gold. That's not how things work nowadays. This was kind of done away with, because you have to remember, the United States is the end-all be-all in terms of international trade. We are the ones who facilitate all international trade. And this is what you would call the Bretton Woods Agreement. Now, Bretton Woods Agreement. Now, the Bretton Woods Agreement is essentially saying, you fuck with international trade, the U.S. military will meet you at full force. That's essentially all it basically did, right? So, all forms of international trade, air, sky, air and sky are the same thing, but air, water, and land travel are all facilitated by the United States military. And essentially, basically telling pirates around the world, fuck around and find out. At the end of the day, that's just what it is. So, the Bretton Woods Agreement is essentially what allows international trade to flow as freely as possible. And this is kind of also the same time that a very nifty system called the SWIFT system came about. And this is what kind of allowed for bilateral agreements between banks, essentially. Banks, financial firms, so on and so on. But remember, there's always an inverse to this, right? Just as much as there is a legal way of doing things, there's also an illegal way of doing things. Now, I guess a person that I would get a lot of flack for mentioning in this video, his name was Charlie Ward. Now, people know this guy as being some QAnon, trust the plan kind of guy, and da-da-da-da-da. But I've listened to this guy talk about his life story on numerous occasions. And he would always talk about how he facilitated money trade. Not just money trade, he would also trade in goods in the form of capital to trade something valuable for something else that was valuable. And he's also mentioned stories about how he would also kind of be involved in trafficking certain goods that were alive. We'll leave it at that. So I'll let the imagination run with that one. And this comes from his own mouth, right? This is stuff that he's admitted to on numerous occasions on different podcasts, because he was just describing how he made his money as he was living life, so on and so on. But I'm just describing Charlie Ward here as there is this legal way of trading money, trading value, and there's also this illegal way that if people have made a living off of basically transferring things of value to other places that wanted or had the demand for that valuable good. Now, either way. All right, just to always remember that. As above, so below. As much as there is something legal, there is also an illegal way of doing things. So, with the gold standard being done away with, it put countries in a situation where, well, it wasn't the Bretton Woods Agreement that did that. Either way. So this currency war, initially back in the, I want to say at the end of the 70s and at the tail end of the early 80s, or at the beginning of the early 80s, there was this kind of struggle that the United States had with international firms across the board. They wanted to do contract work, or at least they wanted the goods of other countries, but fell short at the fact that they couldn't trade the dollar to these other countries because the other countries were like, yeah, your dollar's cool and all, but we don't use your dollar in our ecosystem. We would require you to trade your dollar for our paper, the yuan, the peso, the euro, etc., etc. So the United States, or at least the financial district of the United States, which everybody likes to blame Wall Street, but, you know, I call them the oligarchs of America, kind of found themselves in a position where they had all of this paper currency that was related to their own ecosystem, but they wanted the rest of the world to use it. So all of these guys were just sitting around with all their paper money, and they were trying to figure out, how do we force the rest of the world to use our currency? How do any ideas? Any takers? Well, and that's where the idea of the petrodollar came in. People like to say that the petrodollar isn't real, but Saudi Arabia and the riches that they have amassed kind of prove otherwise. That's on a different side note. So, and we have to remember that, yeah, the petrodollar is nice and all, and that the idea behind the petrodollar is essentially the United States uses the petrodollar in this sense that we give countries dollars. They take these dollars, go to Saudi Arabia, and they basically trade their dollars, the United States dollars, into oil, gasoline, crude, raw, processed, non-processed, so on and so on. But petrodollar sounds nice and all, but we have to remember that there's what we call the Forex, which is the foreign exchange market. It's a form of a stock market where you can essentially trade from one currency into another currency and kind of leverage yourself while the values of these currencies move up or down, etc., etc., so on and so on. So it's just another form of a stock market, but it's a currency stock market. Because I really want to stress that the petrodollar is not policy. It's not a contract. It's not a bilateral agreement. It's not anything that you can opt out of. It's something that not you as a consumer here in America, but it's that every other country around the world understands that, do we want to fuck around? Because we don't really want to find out. Because at the end of the day, if you try buying oil from a different source, using a different form of currency, what happens? Well, this agreement falls apart. The Bretton Woods Agreement falls apart. And we live in a very nasty world where at least the general public doesn't understand that there are mercenary groups. There are conglomeracies who have founded firms who have essentially hired the best men from all of the militaries around the world, put them together, form teams, have purchased very nice toys that can essentially topple countries. Right? And that's just firms that exist outside of the sphere of America, which aren't very many. So when you kind of look into the nitty gritty of these things, they all have one firm that they're all kind of associated with. And that's kind of these guys. But we don't really talk about those guys. They don't really exist. Their sphere of influence doesn't exist. You really can't prove it because there's never been evidence to be proven, and anytime anyone who has found evidence to prove otherwise, well, they kind of mysteriously commit suicide with 2 bullets in the back of the head, so on and so on. So you doesn't exist because you can't prove it. The guy who was talking about it just kind of disappeared and was never to be heard of ever again. So can't prove it. So always remember that. You can't prove it. So petrodollar is just a very convenient excuse that the United States has, where we can basically dish out dollars to all of these other countries, force them to take our money, and it's just like, all right, thanks for your goods, later. And they kind of dip out, they disappear, right? Because we have to remember that just because the United States hands dollars to all of these other international firms, it doesn't mean that it's to their benefit, because they have their own ecosystem. They have their own society, their own cultural standards, their own, I would say, livelihoods. At the end of the day, it's kind of one thing or another, but right, like you can't just give a bunch of, like, you can't give a Japanese firm all of this United States dollars and expect that their economy suddenly have a boom. That's not how value works. That's not how capital works. Again, I'm a complete novice at this, but I can understand that you give Mexico dollars kind of assed out because they can't just take that dollar to the corner store and use it. There needs to be an exchange. But remember this, legal currency exchange shops, sometimes they don't have enough bills to trade in and out of because there is nothing that backs that bill. There's no gold, there's no silver, there's nothing of value that they can inherently attain from that to transfer over into their own ecosystem. They can't just come to America and buy a bunch of concrete, buy bricks, buy some physical tangible thing and then take it back. It's a very complicated process that it kind of comes down to regulations, policies, and laws that kind of don't allow for this ease of use system. There's a lot of friction in between these things. Well, at least there have been a lot of, right, or at least what I'm trying to say is the laws and the policies as they exist now cause a lot of friction for these things not to work that way. And a great way for me to explain this is, why did the United States have to force the rest of the world to buy their oil from Saudi Arabia and not buy oil from American firms? Because that's essentially what happened during the George Bush era. He essentially closed, and I don't want to say shut down because they just exist in limbo, where there were a bunch of these oil barons here in the United States that could produce their own oil, but they closed them down. So instead of allowing for the rest of the world to use the dollar to purchase oil from the United States, that's not what happened. Instead, they were like, no. Don't use the dollar here in American soil. Use the dollar over there in Saudi Arabia. So in a weird way, kind of putting Saudi Arabia in a bit of a chokehold, in a predicament, because now Saudi Arabia is entirely dependent on the American dollar. Because at the end of the day, Saudi Arabia has their own ecosystem, their own bill, their own paper currency, which doesn't necessarily again, local ecosystems just can't use another country's currency freely. There's headway, there's policies, there's laws, so on and so on. It's very complicated for me to explain, right? Because it's not saying that the gold standard solved any of this. The gold standard is just, it was just the way for countries to trust one another, right? Because at the end of the day, gold was something that was valuable regardless of whatever country you came from. So it was just a good hedge for countries to kind of look at each other and side eye one another and trust one another, because it was something that could be used for at least trading between one another. But if you look at Chinese history and the English, that didn't necessarily jive well. And that's where you got a lot of the opium wars, because China was taking in silver and they were taking in gold, but they weren't giving it back. And that really pissed off the English. Welcome to the opium wars, and what Chinese, or at least China, calls the 100 years of shame. So, regardless, there is no trust between these countries because they all have their own ecosystems. They don't trust one another, and it's very difficult for them to integrate other forms of currency into their own ecosystem, because at the end of the day, it puts them in a wedge where they're forced to, or at least the way the system works now is, everybody just uses the petrodollar. Everybody just buys oil from Saudi Arabia. And oil is the lifeblood of a lot of things. Polyester, plastic. Like oil is a very plastic, water, like anything that uses plastic, the toys, housing materials, not housing materials as in like a house. I'm talking about things that encapsulate the product. There's just a lot of uses for oil. So essentially it's just kind of like a raw material that could be used in processing other goods. It's kind of what I'm saying. There's the nice way that this could all work out, but that's not how our world works. Remember, there's a lot of bribery involved. And in a bribe, or at least in a trade or in an agreement between one party and another party, one party always wants to be not above the other party, but there is, what do you call it? There needs to be a net gain for the other person to take on that risk, to take on that liability. And that's just how business works. So, and I guess back in, or at least at some point in time in the 70s, that liability was the fact that the other party was responsible for transferring or transporting those goods or that raw material out of the country that they were purchasing it from, i.e., where the Bretton Woods Agreement came from, i.e., that's where the US military kind of threatens everybody at the point of a gun to, like, hey, you can't just take that tree sap from that trade, because in a weird way, the United States military is protecting the interest of companies, corporations, and basically, essentially, they're allowing things to work as such. Right? Either way. Right? So, like, a great example of this is if batteries require cobalt and all of these rare earth materials, a company, a corporation, has to take the risk of going into Africa, buying land, excavating, so on and so on, all the way down to workers, their salaries, the fiscal year salaries, so on and so on. But they also take on the risk of having to transport that raw material out of that country to whatever processing plant, and that processing plant also then has to transfer the processed good, or at least the finished product, to another factory, and that factory has to use then that product and another product, and right, it's like a conveyor belt. It's all very complicated, wobbly jobbly, wibbly wobbly, whatever the fuck. And remember, at each endpoint, there are salaries, there are workers, there's a paper bill being transferred for the workers' services. Ecology, right? There are these ecosystems that are very complicated, and they're involved in every single part of this chain of line of things, right? So I guess a point that I'm missing is the nice way of all this working out is if each country was trading each other's currency, well, the country or the company or the corporation in these countries would take that paper bill, go back to that country, and purchase something that they require, something that they need. But when you look at where a lot of raw materials are being processed, or at least where a lot of raw materials are being used, it's not necessarily the country that they're receiving money from. So there's a lot of like friction. And friction in this sense is just ease of use, is what I'm trying to describe. So currency is a very complicated thing. Because countries don't trust one another, right? What was that one country that essentially printed their own currency to oblivion, and then at the end of the day their currency was worth absolutely nothing? That's what they're all afraid of. Because they don't trust one another. Because the organization that prints the money isn't necessarily a bank, an accountant. It's its own kind of like separate entity, kind of like us as the Federal Reserve. People think that the Federal Reserve is some internal United States entity, but it's its own corporation, and it kind of stands out from the legal framework of America, and it's complicated. Like it's fucking complicated. I can get into it in detail, but I don't think anybody wants to hear that side of the story. There's a really great quote. I don't like ever saying the name of the guy because everybody's like, "Oh, he said that guy's name," and it's just like, dude, who cares? Like, these people just understand what money is. They understand at the end of the day that the printable bill is worth nothing, because they understand that if they could just print it, they stand above the power structure. And the quote goes, I might be like butchering it, but the quote essentially says, if you give me the power to manage and handle the currency, I care not for who manages the laws of the land. I'm butchering it, and I know I am. But that guy essentially kind of put himself and wedged himself in American society to such a point where, to this day, our currency kind of stands as king internationally because of him. I wish I could remember that quote very well, but I'm not about to Google that right now. And that's just the currency aspect of things. Now, capital and trade. Well, I guess I've been talking about trade as I've gone along. So, next thing that I'm going to talk about is capital. Now, please, let me zoom in. Thank you. Capital. Now, not the capital of a state or the capital of a country. I'm talking about capital in terms of property. And, you know, property comes in the form of land, a good, a unique service. It's a very difficult thing to describe, but a unique service in the sense of something that can only be provided by said country because of their cultural standard, or because of the manufacturing process, or there has to be some unique aspect of things. Land, good, unique services. I guess in a weird way I could put company. The reason why I can put company is because of the brand and what the brand is associated with, where the brand came from. And a lot of that is also kind of public opinion, because because it builds this sort of repertoire. It builds this sort of like myth, this sort of legend, that if the brand or the company decides to stray away from it, it loses its value. So brand and public opinion are kind of tied with one another. Now, in a weird way, a contract is also a form of capital because people don't know this, but some contracts have been indefinite, and there have been some instances where the contract itself is sold. But that gets into a lot of legal jargon that I'm not privy to. Either way, so capital is essentially me describing that there is this thing that holds inherent value. So a thing has, or a thing which has value. Da 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 da. Very difficult for me to describe this. Now, there's a big problem in this because property or land are tied to location factor. Excuse me, I had to burp. The geolocation factor. So I guess I'm going to go with land. This is tied to a geo-specific region. Now, with it being tied to a geo-specific region, what I'm essentially trying to describe here is the fact that this goes back to countries not trusting one another. Because when I first used this, let's say, I guess I could use that example. So Korea has a Korean Air building here in Los Angeles, right? Korean Air building. That means to some degree, okay, so the reason why I'm using Korea as an example here is because they have a very deeply rooted corporation society that highly differs itself from most companies, corporations from anywhere else around the world, because I don't know if I'm spelling this right, but they have a chubol society. Now, chubol is, I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right, so I apologize in advance, but it's essentially this form of hierarchy where there are these families that kind of control their corporations, and they only really allow family members to hold certain positions within corporations, and they groom their kids from like the beginning to the end to make sure that they are prepared for these positions of power. So it's very aristocratical in a sense. So when Korean Air decided to buy a building in LA, to some degree they had to deal with law firms, politicians, city hall, landed owner, landed slash lease contracts, or just contract in general. Or actually, I just put land contract, right? Because there's a lot of friction in purchasing land, getting architectural schematics approved. There's a lot of what do I call these entities? I don't know how to describe this. There's a lot of what do I call it? We'll just need to say firm approval. Now, what I'm trying to say by this is you can't just build a building. You can't just build a skyscraper. And when you look into how to build a building from scratch, it's expensive. Like, it's really expensive. I've heard stories from my own personal standing where people don't want to go that route because of how many hoops you have to go through, how many times you have to meet with city hall officials. You have to then not only meet with city hall officials, but you also have to You need lawyers. You need the approval of different firms. Different by firms, I'm talking more about like city district firms, in the sense that you need to talk to whatever bureau oversees the schematics of the architecture, those that approve contract works. Then you have to deal with unions. Then you have to deal with their salaries. You have to then deal with contract firms, in the sense of where are you purchasing the raw materials from? Where are you going to get that steel from? Then how are you going to transport that? There's a lot of headroom in order for this kind of thing to be facilitated. But again, we like to think that the world is nice and peachy, but that's not how it works. They have, in my opinion, this is just my opinion, whatever Koreans had to facilitate this deal to occur, they probably had to fucking bribe a lot of fucking people in order for this to occur. And they know, right? Because if you look at the Chobol, or the aristocrat society of corporations of Korea, that's how they've managed themselves for years. And that's how, in my opinion, these families have stayed in power, because they understand that the world is not as colorful, rainbows and sunshine, that it is, that they understand that they need to hire certain security bodyguards. They need to protect themselves in a variety of different ways, so that they aren't taken advantage of by international entities. Because it's a very cutthroat world that we live in, and people kind of don't see that side of our reality. So, with the Korean Air building being built here, I can imagine the sort of hoops and the sort of things that they needed to kind of... Because at one point in time during its construction, I was working in downtown. They had a worker who accidentally kind of fell off the side of the building, and you can imagine what kind of noise and what kind of friction that occurred, so on and so on and so on. So, again, to some degree, I'm essentially saying that the country of Korea had to take a form of liability in building this building here in America. Now, that liability came in the form of bribes, shaking hands, kissing ass, who knows, in order for that building to be built here. And to some degree, that liability also lands on the responsibility of the Korean government. There's a reason why I'm saying the Korean government, right? Because at the end of the day, there's an ultimate beneficiary owner for that building. That means there's a family who owns that building. There are people who have, at the end of the day, it can't just be one owner. There's probably stocks, or there's probably a form of distribution that comes down to the ownership of the building and all these other rights that are associated with it. Now, the reason why I'm bringing up the Korean government is because, to some degree, we also have to understand that the people who are kind of financing this whole thing, you really think that they're just financing a building? You think that they aren't financing other aspects of the world by and large? Right? Paying off politicians, kind of funding certain government officials, or funding certain campaigns to allow certain friends to kind of scratch their back when needed. Again, Chobol society is very fucked up. There's a lot of dramas. We call them K-dramas, but whatever. Point is, there's a lot of interesting stories that are rumored to be true. So I can only imagine how much back scratching occurs in Asian societies, because they actually look out for one another, especially when they have favorable relations. So, where am I going with this? So, the Korean Air building is in LA. So how is the Korean government going to flex any ownership or any rights to that building when geolocationally it's not in Korea? It's not as easy to bribe people in a different country. It's not as easy to have some form of control in a different geo-specific region. So when companies are investing in one another, or at least when a foreign company is investing in another foreign country, there's a lot of liability. And usually they do not want to take that risk because at the end of the day, that building is tied to Los Angeles. And because of that, what is susceptible to it being in Los Angeles, well, now you have entities within that country in itself that can find ways to legally flex their chops on that building. How do I describe what I'm trying to say? In a weird way, I'm trying to say that this is hypothetical, incredibly hypothetical, where there could be a lawsuit. Somebody could get sued, so on and so on. And it puts a liability on the owner of that building, or the manager of that building, or the board of directors, or whatever committee, or whatever conglomeracy. It puts them at a disadvantage because these people aren't from this region. So it's not as easy to pay off certain police officers, certain politicians, certain key city officials, so on and so on. So it puts a lot of risk. There's a lot of risk factor in associating with that. So geo-specifically, that land can be put up into question. And the capital, or at least the value of that land, the value of that building, the value of how much money was spent in building it, so on and so on, right? There's a lot of money online to make sure things run as smoothly as they do. It's kind of why people get bribed. So it's kind of why you see a lot of countries not taking that risk in investing their money or buying companies from a foreign country. Because at the end of the day, and you also get into the aspect of whatever Korean laws exist in Korea, they do not apply in America. And I'm not talking about it from a judicial standpoint. I'm talking about the fact that the law of the land, or the law, or the language of the law is different. And how that law is expressed could be incredibly different depending on the wording of the language. So I'm basically trying to describe the fact that legalese, I think that's the word used to describe language of law, or the law of language. No, language of the law. Right? Because law has its own language. It has its own words, and those words have different definitions from how common folk kind of speak to one another. So you can imagine how many lawyers are involved in each of these proceedings, because the friction there comes in the fact that the way that law is expressed in Korea could be different from the way that it's expressed here in America. So just think of how much money is at stake here, from paying lawyers to paying law firms to paying off people to shaking the right hands and so on and so on and so on. Like, it just, you could bury your head when you look at these from a very specific point of view. That's why I kind of view things from a very outside perspective, because if you just understand the basics of what I'm putting down, it's easier to follow that way. Right? So it puts the capital at risk. There's a lot of risk in owning capital. And I guess in a weird way, you can also express this state to state here in America, because state to state laws also kind of change, policy also kind of changes, and the people that you deal with also changes. This is kind of why we're in a cultural war, because the way people think and the way people behave also kind of puts things at risk. What people kind of value, their principles, so on and so on, right? But I feel like I'm trying to grab for these grand big ideas that I could just barely put a hand on. But again, capital is very specific to the governing factors that are over it. So in terms of land, I'm just basically describing why it's difficult for certain foreign entities to want to own entities in a different land because of how difficult the nature of owning these things would be, and kind of the headway that they would need, not the headway, but like the way that they would flex ownership rights over these different things is expressed very differently. And that's just to land, right? So how China, I guess a great thing for me to segue into this is China. China. So China, as we all know, has been purchasing US farmland. I always wondered how are they doing this? Who's helping them? Because buying land, because you have to remember, China within itself, all companies, corporations, LLCs, all forms of financial entities are overseen by the CCP. All of them. All of them. Yes, they have this aristocratical society like they do in Korea, but it's very different because they have to get approved. They have seniority in the sense that their hierarchy works in the sense that they can only move about or express certain movements in society through the approval of their superiors or their elders. So when this was occurring, I'm like, what American law firms, politicians, / city officials, or not just city officials, but like local all them local authority. Just gonna leave it like that. There's always a form of friction for certain wills to be expressed in. Who's writing up these deeds? Who's writing up these contracts to allow and facilitate for one country to buy this much land? How is that occurring? Who's allowing that to occur? And you know what I mean? You can always find, right, where you see smoke, there's a fire, but nobody ever asks who started the fire? Who allowed those embers to, who sparked the flint and the stone, who blew on the leaves, who facilitated the fanning of that flame? There's always these elements that allow for these things to occur. Lightning does strike and, it could cause a fire, but that's rare. That's very rare. So, I always wondered, like, where does the facilitation and how do these things get greased up in order for them to occur? Because this is a geospecific region sort of thing. Because if China sees, the way that China can really do this is the fact that they get paid in American dollars. One of the things that nobody really talks about is the fact that China has been using the American dollar that they receive from selling all their crap. They use their American dollars around the world to purchase raw material in order for them to build their empty cities, in order for them to buy concrete, bricks, all this other stuff. They use American dollars in order to bolster themselves and in order to create this false sense of GDP, this false sense of bravado, but they're not using their own currency. They use the currency of the United States in order to build themselves up. So I'm always like, why is nobody asking this question? Like, why? How is this occurring? So, because at the end of the day, capital, or things that hold value, aren't always necessarily the currency that they have, but the raw resources and the raw manpower that they have. And that's where kind of China makes their bread and butter with, which is the fact that they just have raw manpower and a lot of raw resources within their desert region in order for them to manufacture the goods that they have. and the unique service that they're providing is the fact that they just have so much manpower that they can just, they can just allow a lot of people to fall to the wayside to their deathbed because, we got Li Ping or Zhao Ming to replace whoever the fuck just died. Either way, very fucked up for me to say it, but it's the way that they're operating. Like, no big news to anybody else. So, Capital, that's just me describing the service. Because at the end of the day, what I wanted to really talk about when I mentioned Capital is the fact that there are just these other form of things that hold value. Oh yeah, I should also write precious metals. I just forgot that. Precious metals. And the reason why I can really say that is because if you look at the purchasing that China and Russia have been making of physical gold these last 3 years is astronomical. Like, they're preparing for something that they're aware of. And it's not even like if you compare it to other years, it's crazy. And they even, in China specifically, they even had one of their top executives, like, his house was raided and all they found was just a mansion just full of gold sitting there. Like, it was hella crazy. I think that was in 2019. Either way. Capital, things that hold value. This is kind of why I wrote property. Because property also comes in the form of luxury goods. And remember that. Luxury goods comes down to the brand. So, cars, equipment, I guess I could write jewelry. Kind of, not really, I don't know. But capital, and this is very kind of a short description because it's just something that inherently holds value. And there's not much really I could talk about because in goods, I could talk about how the fact that with manufactured products and manufactured goods, at the end of the day, we have to remember that these goods have a purchase value. They have a market, a demand, not always, but to some degree they do. It just depends on what sucker you can find to buy the good. I guess a great example would be that fidget spinner. So it's like, dude, there's just a couple bearings and like a thing that just makes it spin. But yet, that processed good had a high enough demand that it made a few people kind of really wealthy. But again, there's also contracts, loans that you can take on manufactured goods. Because if whatever bank entity you're dealing with sees inherent value in the good that you're providing, they themselves are more than willing to repo it or offer you a loan on it, right? They can only repo it if they actually gave you a loan on it, but you get the point that I'm trying to lay down here. And with companies or a corporation, at the end of the day, the capital there is the brand name. And remember, the brand name is heavily tied to the public opinion, or at least the public perception of the product thing that you're selling. Think of like Louis Vuitton. Think of like Lamborghini, Bugattis. Like, yes, there are physical, tangible things, but at the end of the day, the name brand and the name recognition that comes along with the public is kind of what allows for it to have the sort of capital, or at least the market value that it does have. With certain contracts, I guess a great example of this would be music catalogs. I guess an example I could use is like Michael Jackson owning the catalog for the Beatles, most of the Beatles music. So that means anytime somebody wanted to use a Beatles song, the person that they were paying copyrights to was Michael Jackson himself. So, right, there's this other factor that you can own certain contracts and reap the net value or the net revenue of any time a movie or anytime the song was used or anytime the melody was used, you were the person receiving that revenue from from whatever that is, because at the end of the day, you owned the contract to that thing. Wow, I really need to drink something right now. Okay. Whew. How long have I been going? Jeez Louise. An hour and 30. Jeez. I'm not even at trade yet. No, crypto. Did the stream stop? I don't know. Oh no, I think the stream stopped. It looks good on my end. Either way. I guess the crypto portion of this I could just make it very brief. Because it does kind of tie into capital. But there is this new thing called crypto. Or it's not really new. It's been around since 2012 if you kind of followed it along. But with crypto, can I change to like me? Yes. Okay. So with crypto, I don't really have a slide for it. I do not want to talk about any one crypto in specific because there's a lot of legality. There's a lot of lawsuits currently going on. There's a lot of backstory that people don't understand. So I have a lot of gripes with cryptocurrency. Because, for example, if you look at Bitcoin, I look at the fact that Jeffrey Epstein was kind of financing one of the most veteran developers for Bitcoin, was hired by MIT, and Joy Ito, which was the guy who set up the digital currency initiative, was kind of financed and was somebody who was allowed to exist in his position thanks to Jeffrey Epstein and Bill Gates. If you look at Ethereum, you had a lot of old school financial firms that kind of wanted Ethereum to succeed. And, a lot of cryptocurrencies get a lot of bad rap for scams, but when you kind of get into the nitty gritty nature of it, a lot of it was because the infrastructure for Ethereum, or at least its programming language called Solidarity, or I don't even know what the programming language is called, but it's basically a problem with the infrastructure. And the fact that, if more people knew the programming language, or at least programming language in general, they could understand the pitfalls to these things. But at the end of the day, if people were too educated, you couldn't get a sucker to get a lick off of. And that's just those two currencies. If you look at XRP, people call it a banker's coin. But if you look at the infrastructure, it would tell you otherwise. If you look at XLM, I look at XLM being very problematic in the sense that I found it incredibly weird how they were one of the few firms, or at least one of the few company entities, that were allowed to sit down with Congress and some House committee, oversight committee hearings, and they were just allowed to exist there and give their public opinion. And usually when you get that sort of favorability in terms of politics, there's usually something really fishy going on there. And you had to shake the right hands, you had to lobby correctly, you needed some form of greasing of the pig in order for these things to land favorably on your side of the fence. So I find a lot of weirdness when it comes down to it. But when you get to the nitty gritty of what the technology can do, I'm not talking about the people that program it. A lot of people like to look at this as an evil thing, but it's only evil if you allow evil people to take hold of it. If I get very black-pilled when I think of like people and how ignorant they are of programming language. But if we had a society that understood the thing that they were dealing with, we wouldn't be looking at it from this perspective. Because if that was the case, and we were about to point the finger and be like, cryptocurrency is completely evil, well, why haven't you done that with contracts? Why haven't you done that with lawyers, with judges, with prosecutors, with defendants? With the very nature of how our legal system is, I think our current legal system is far worse than anything that cryptocurrency can do, because you have this legal side that is protected by the United States government that is allowed to act corrupt as fuck. But oh no, we would just only like to look at cryptocurrency as it being the only thing that could be that way. When you look at how our political system is structured, with how our campaigning financial infrastructure, how politicians are kind of at the behest of people who fund them, and how the media kind of runs cover for a lot of these people, and how they kind of blatantly defend one-sidedly a certain aspect of the story. Like, I'm like, bruh, technology is problematic, but the way things are now are far more problematic. And of course, if you incorporate crypto into it, it could be far more detrimental to our society. But when you really look at what cryptocurrency can do, it could knock out so many corrupt aspects of our society, and it could kick it out. It could completely crumble a lot of corrupt practices. And something that I really tried to express in the original video that I made was I brought up Nipsey Hussle, and Nipsey Hussle was trying to create his own cryptocurrency. It was called Follow Coin. But the way that he was envisioning it was he wanted to create a sort of infrastructure that allowed for independent people. If you just had $100, he wanted to see or create an infrastructure that allowed for you to give that $100 to an artist, right? So essentially you were investing in an artist, and if that artist took off, or at least did well in his career, you could see that investment that you made go up in value. And the only entity that would really put at jeopardy would be who? Music executives. These corrupt production firms that kind of like promise up and coming artists a life, but in reality they just basically suck the artist dry, and they give them fractions, barely percentages of what the internal revenue is for some of these conglomeracies. I'm thinking of like Def Jam, Capitol Records, and you know, it's kind of predatory with the way that they do it. Is they'll basically tell like, oh yeah, Mac Miller, we'll give you your own brand and we'll allow you to sign other artists, but at the end of the day it's a pyramid scheme where if Mac Miller signed artists, that essentially mean that Mac Miller was earning a percent of the artist that he signed, but Mac Miller had to give a percent of what he was earning to the company that essentially first signed him, or at least the distribution rights, or at least the people that were kind of handled the CD sales, right? Because it's all contract work. So essentially it's like a pyramid scheme in the sense of you only get some, but at the same time I get some of what you get some, and you're getting some of what people you have under you. And it's this really weird like pyramid scheme. And you know, if you look at kind of like t-shirts, if you look at clothing brands and how they don't essentially give rights to the artists who are basically developing t-shirts or developing designs for these other companies, and how contracts are essentially written up in such a degree where they're not in your favor, right? Because you know, it all comes down to, do you have the lawyers? Do you have competent enough lawyers to be able to read the contract that we're about to hand you? And even then, if the company knows you're contacting certain lawyers, or at least a lot of these companies know who the best lawyers are in the industry, so they're going to get ahead of you to make sure that they communicate to those lawyers and bribe them to make sure that they tell you, at least that lawyer that you're communicating with, the corporation's going to talk to that lawyer first, tell them like, here, we'll give you this much money, and you tell him everything he wants to hear and get him to sign that contract. And that's the nice way of doing things. The other way of doing things is blackmailing you, extorting you, and or finding compromising information on you in order to kind of get you to bend the knee. And that's the world we live in is not very nice. But if cryptocurrency was involved, or at least some form of electronic contract, and if people were competent enough to understand the programming language, you would circumvent that. Because at the end of the day, you would put mechanisms or infrastructures that would allow you the security of reaping the net value or the net benefit of whatever structure you can put into place. But again, that comes down to understanding the programming language. And at the end of the day, you can also write up copyright law. But this all comes down to the fact that the law is never in the favor of the common man. And the fact that like our law or our judicial system is set up in a way to only really protect one side of the aisle. It's not really in the favor of the common man. So people look at cryptocurrency as a very evil thing, but if we had the right people kind of pushing this in the right direction, it would completely topple law firms, because you can internally set certain electronic contracts and internally set them to certain percentages. And if the copyright law at least saw certain NFTs and protected them, it would only really put the user and the person uploading their own copyrighted protected images, it would only work in their favor. Because now if a firm or if a company wanted to use those NFTs, they would have to adhere to whoever owned the token that corresponded to whatever artwork or whatever design, like whoever owned that NFT, the company, corporation, or whatever brand, they have to deal with the individual at that point. And if it's an electronic contract, there's nothing they could do. And if there's a level of anonymity in the sense that they don't know who's receiving the revenue to that token, it kind of puts the company or the corporation or the brand merchandiser, it puts them at jeopardy, because they're like, damn, if I could only bribe this person, if I can only gyp them out of their artwork, or you know what I mean? It would work very differently. But the technology itself right now, as it is in its infancy stage. And I don't know. You with the way that these lawsuits are also kind of going, and I'm talking about Library, I'm talking about Ripple, they're trying to set a precedent that isn't in the benefit of the individual or of the consumer. It's only there for the benefit of companies, corporations, and conglomeracies. They do not want to see this work in the favor of the common man, because all it takes is one good genius who understands programming language to completely topple over this system that we have now. That's all it would really take. Because if you think about it, patents are essentially NFTs. Let me say that one more time. Patents, as they exist now, are NFTs. The only difference is there is no cryptography aspect to things. When you submit a patent, that means every single corporation around the world can now see your patent. Yes, it's protected by the United States law, but at the end of the day, to some degree, you have to make it public. So that means the rest of the world can see it, which kind of puts you at liability, because other people can kind of steal your work. And, you kind of have to flex. But do you have the lawyers? Do you have the money in order to pay that sort of lawsuit? You get into these points of friction that make it very difficult for the common folk to be able to express their copyright over the material that they own, unless they're kind of like witty enough to be able to fight the lawsuit themselves. But again, you would have to understand legalese, you would have to understand contracts, and you know what I mean? People are kind of in over their head. But if there was a cryptographic, by that I mean if there was a form of encryption that allowed only the owner to view his material, in the sense that I don't know how to say this. I just heard a really great talk about it, but this was like, I want to say a year and a half ago, about how just like patents are essentially just NFTs. But in a weird way, he was basically describing that you can allow other people to use your invention. You would just have to set it. You would just have to set an internal contract within your own electronic contract to be like, all right, you give me this much percentage of you using my technology or my design or my thing. You just give me this much revenue back, and you can freely use my patent as however you wish to. It's a very novel idea as the way it is now. And we're at an infancy stage of what cryptocurrency is, because you have to remember the token, like, not all of these, there's a difference between a token and a coin. A token is something that exists within the network system that you're corresponding to. So if you own an NFT or an art design or whatever, the NFT is within the network that it's attached to. So if you own a token on the Cardano network, that means you can only move it and express it within the Cardano network. If you own a token within the Ethereum network, that means that token only exists within the ecosystem of Ethereum. If you own a token on the I don't know how many networks actually can own tokens, but a token always corresponds to a network. A coin is essentially the gas, or the coin is essentially what allows for the network to move and operate in. So Ethereum is a coin. That means anytime that you move a token within the Ethereum network, you need to use the coin. You need to use bits of the pieces of the coin in order to move the token within that network. In a weird way, there's no difference between that and the Swift system, because the Swift system is essentially just that. You cannot move any of the money within the Swift network unless there are two people live on the network. These two people can be represented as coins, because that means, in a weird way, both of these people have to hit the same button at the same time in order for the money to move within this network. And the money in the network is essentially the token that's being moved around. So it's a weird way of seeing it. But the differences within these networks is you don't need people. The network is protected. The network itself is protected because of its encryption layers. And, that gets into a whole other bag of woo-woo, but I'll leave it there because I'm already an hour and 47 minutes in. My name is Ramirez, and I'll probably make a part 2 to this because I probably forgot something. So